Simone Bennett stood in the middle of a house she had never once set foot in before that week, a house with ceilings taller than any room she had ever lived in, holding a folder of legal documents that her hands would not stop shaking around. It wasn't grief making them shake. Her grandfather had been a stranger to her entire life, a name her mother rarely spoke and never explained. What made her hands shake was what she had just read inside that folder, sitting alone in a study that still smelled like someone else's cologne. 3 days after her grandfather's funeral, Simone found out 2 things in the same afternoon. She was worth more money than she could count, and her husband already knew before she did. Take a moment to sit with that, because it took Simone considerably longer than a moment to sit with it herself. Somewhere in that same week, she would find herself sliding that same folder calmly across a table toward her husband and the woman who had been her best friend since they were 19 years old, both of them frozen, neither of them saying a single word, because there was nothing left for either of them to say that Simone hadn't already confirmed herself. He didn't leave her for her best friend. He left her for what he thought she would never find out. And by the time Simone slid that folder across the table, he had already learned exactly how wrong that assumption was. Before going any further, let's pause for just a second. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, back to where this really started, because none of what happened in that study makes sense without understanding who Simone was before she ever knew her grandfather's name meant anything at all, and who the 2 people sitting across that table from her really were underneath everything she thought she knew about them. Simone grew up in a modest, tight-knit neighborhood on the south side of Atlanta, raised by a mother who worked long shifts as a nurse and rarely talked about her own upbringing beyond a few careful sentences. Simone knew, in the vague way children absorb family history, that her mother had once been part of a wealthier family somewhere up north, and that something had happened decades earlier that severed that connection completely. She never pushed for details growing up. Her mother's silence on the subject had a weight to it that even as a child Simone understood not to disturb. They built their own life instead, small and steady, full of church potlucks and Sunday dinners, and a kind of quiet dignity that never once felt like it was missing anything. Simone's father passed away when she was 11, and her mother raised her mostly alone after that, working double shifts at the hospital, while Simone's grandmother, on her father's side, helped fill in the hours her mother couldn't be home. They didn't have much, but what they had felt complete in a way Simone never once questioned as a child. Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house were the anchor of the week, plates passed around a table that somehow always had enough, even though, looking back, it shouldn't have. Simone's mother told her once, when she was maybe 14 and asking too many questions about a school project on family trees, that some branches simply don't need to be drawn, that not every root is worth digging up. Simone didn't understand what she meant then. She understood it considerably better standing in an attorney's office decades later. There was a particular kind of pride in how Simone's mother raised her, a pride built on the idea that they didn't need anything they hadn't earned themselves. Her mother never once suggested, even in the hardest years, that there might be an easier path available through a family she had chosen to walk away from. Looking back, that pride is part of why the news of the inheritance felt so disorienting when it finally arrived, because it contradicted something Simone had built her entire identity around, the idea that whatever she had built with her own hands and nobody else's. Learning that an enormous fortune had been sitting quietly on the other side of a decision her mother made before Simone was even born forced her to reconsider parts of her own story she had never thought to question. Simone met Marcus during her 2nd year at Spelman at a mutual friend's cookout that ran long into the evening, the kind of gathering where everyone eventually ends up in the same corner of the yard, talking about nothing and everything at once. Marcus was funny in an easy, unforced way, the kind of funny that made you feel like the joke was something the 2 of you shared privately even in a crowd. He told her that night he was studying finance, that he wanted to build something real one day, something with his name on it. She liked how sure he sounded, the same way you like the sound of rain before you know whether it's going to flood anything. They dated through the rest of college, married 2 years after graduation in a small ceremony at Simone's mother's church, surrounded by people who had known her entire life, and by people she assumed would always be part of it. There's a particular memory from the early years of their marriage that Simone has returned to often since everything unraveled, one that felt entirely ordinary at the time. Marcus and Simone were sitting on the floor of their first apartment, surrounded by unopened boxes, arguing gently about whether they could afford a specific couch they both liked, and he told her, half joking, that one day he wanted to be the kind of husband who never had to have that conversation again. Simone laughed and told him she didn't need a life without that conversation, that the conversation itself, the two of them figuring things out together, was part of what made the life feel like theirs. He laughed too, and Simone believed, completely, that he meant it as a joke about ambition rather than a genuine discomfort with the kind of ordinary life they were building. She understands now that some part of that discomfort never fully went away. It simply learned to stay quiet until an opportunity eventually gave it somewhere to go. Renee had been Simone's closest friend since their first week at Spelman, when they ended up as roommates through nothing more than administrative luck. They were an unlikely match on paper. Renee loud where Simone was quiet, Renee impulsive where Simone planned everything 3 steps ahead, but somehow it worked from the very beginning. Renee was the maid of honor at Simone's wedding. She was the person Simone called first when anything good or bad happened in her life for almost 2 decades. Simone trusted her the way you trust your own reflection, without ever thinking to double-check it. Looking back now, trust like that, unquestioned for that long, becomes exactly the kind of thing certain people learn to build plans around. There's a version of their friendship that people who only knew them casually never fully saw. The version built on smaller, quieter moments, rather than the big milestones everyone remembers. Renee was the person who sat with Simone in a hospital waiting room the night her grandmother passed. The person who drove 3 hours without hesitation the one time Simone's car broke down on a trip neither of them had planned carefully enough. Simone trusted her judgment more than almost anyone else's, asked her opinion on decisions ranging from which house to buy to whether a dress made her look like she was trying too hard for a work event that didn't matter nearly as much as she treated it at the time. Whatever words might try to capture how completely Simone trusted her, the trust wasn't a decision made consciously at any point. It was simply the water Simone had been standing in for 20 years without ever once checking its depth. Their marriage, for the better part of a decade, was steady in a way that most people would call enviable if they ever thought to examine it closely, which almost nobody does with a marriage that isn't currently falling apart. Marcus worked his way up at a regional investment firm, competent, but never quite reaching the heights he had once talked about at that cookout all those years earlier. Simone taught elementary school, the same grade for 8 years running, finding a quiet satisfaction in work that didn't ask her to prove herself to anyone beyond a room full of 9-year-olds. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. The kind of comfortable that lets you stop thinking about money most days. And Simone genuinely believed, right up until the week everything changed, that she and Marcus had built something solid enough to last the rest of their lives. There was a specific afternoon, a little over a year before Simone's grandfather's funeral, that now means far more than it seemed to at the time. Simone and Renee were having lunch, and somewhere between appetizers and the check, Renee made an offhand comment about Simone's mother's side of the family, something about how she'd always assumed there was more money back there than anyone let on, given a few details Simone's mother had mentioned once at a holiday gathering years earlier. Simone laughed it off completely, told her that her mother's family history was mostly a mystery even to her, and moved on to whatever they were actually there to talk about. She didn't think about that comment again for almost a year. She had no reason to. Renee made offhand comments about all kinds of things. That one simply happened to be true in a way neither of them understood yet. There was another moment, smaller than the lunch conversation, but one that stayed with Simone longer than it should have at the time, a Sunday afternoon maybe 8 months before her grandfather's death, when Marcus asked, seemingly out of nowhere, whether her mother had ever mentioned specifics about her father's line of work. Simone told him honestly that she didn't know much beyond vague impressions, real estate of some kind, up north somewhere, details she had never had reason to press for. He nodded, said it was just curiosity, and the conversation moved on to something else entirely within minutes. Simone didn't think about it again until months later, sitting in an attorney's office, when the timing of that casual question suddenly took on a weight it had never carried before. The call about Simone's grandfather came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, from a woman identifying herself as an estate attorney named Foster Lang, informing Simone that a man named Walter Ashford had passed away, and that, as his only surviving descendant through her mother's line, her presence was required at a formal reading of his will. Simone stood in her kitchen holding the phone, genuinely confused, asking twice whether Foster had the right person, because the name Walter Ashford meant almost nothing to her beyond a vague memory of her mother mentioning it once, years earlier, with an expression Simone hadn't understood at the time and still couldn't fully place. When Simone called her mother afterward, her mother went quiet on the phone for a long moment before finally explaining, in careful, measured sentences, that Walter Ashford was her father, a man she had walked away from decades earlier over a disagreement she had never fully explained to Simone, and one she still wasn't ready to explain even now. Simone sat with her mother in her living room a few days after that phone call, watching her mother's hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she never actually drank, as her mother finally told her pieces of a story she had kept folded away for decades. Walter Ashford, her mother explained, had been a demanding, exacting man, someone who measured love in terms of achievement and approval, someone who had made his disapproval of Simone's father brutally clear the one time he met him, calling him unsuitable in front of people her mother had considered friends. She said she had made a choice that day, standing in his study much like the one Simone would later stand in herself, to walk away from everything he represented, rather than spend her life trying to earn approval that was never going to arrive. She said she never regretted the choice, only the silence she had wrapped around it afterward, silence she now realized had left Simone unprepared for exactly what eventually came looking for her. Simone attended the will reading alone. Marcus told her, the morning of, that something urgent had come up at work, an excuse delivered with a kind of ease that Simone didn't think twice about at the time, though she's replayed the calmness of it more times than she can count since then. It struck her only later how little curiosity he showed about a man whose entire existence she had only just learned about days earlier, how a husband who otherwise paid close attention to anything involving money or family didn't ask a single follow-up question about either. Simone drove to the attorney's office that morning, expecting a brief, formal appointment, something she would describe to Marcus over dinner that evening as strange but ultimately unremarkable. What she walked into instead reshaped everything she thought she understood about her own life in the span of about 40 minutes. Foster Lang walked Simone through the property itself before they ever got to the specifics of the will, a house set back from the road on land that seemed to stretch further than any single family could reasonably need. Simone stood in the entryway, taking in furniture that had clearly been chosen decades earlier by someone who never had to think twice about cost, and felt a strange, disorienting grief for a man she had never actually known, a grief less about losing him personally and more about losing the decades of time in which knowing him might have meant something different for both of them. Foster mentioned, gently, that Walter had kept photographs of Simone's mother from her childhood in a drawer in his study, never displayed, but never thrown away either, a detail that told Simone more about the complicated nature of his regret than any legal document ever could. Foster's office was calm and unhurried in a way that felt almost deliberately at odds with what she was about to tell Simone. She explained, gently but directly, that Walter Ashford had built a substantial fortune over 5 decades in commercial real estate, quietly, without the kind of public profile that tends to attract attention, and that despite the estrangement from Simone's mother, he had never removed either of them from his will. Simone was, as it turned out, his only remaining direct descendant, and the primary beneficiary of an estate large enough that Foster had to repeat the figure twice before Simone fully absorbed it. Simone sat in that office in a kind of suspended disbelief, trying to reconcile the modest, private life she had always known with a number that didn't seem to belong anywhere near it. What happened next in that meeting is the part Simone keeps returning to, the part that changed the entire shape of the story she thought she was living. Foster Lang, almost as an afterthought, mentioned that Simone's inheritance wasn't entirely unprecedented information within a small circle of people, that roughly a year earlier, someone had contacted the estate's outside counsel asking informal questions about Walter Ashford's family situation, specifically about whether any estranged relatives might stand to inherit should anything happen to him. Foster hadn't thought much of it at the time, she explained, since these kinds of inquiries happen occasionally around aging estates, usually from distant relatives or curious acquaintances. But she felt obligated to mention it now, given the timing, in case it meant something to Simone. It meant everything to Simone. It meant someone close to her had known, or at least suspected, long before she ever did. Simone sat in her car in the attorney's parking lot for nearly an hour after that meeting ended, unable to make herself drive home yet, running through every possible innocent explanation for who might have made that inquiry a year earlier. She told herself it could have been a distant cousin she'd never met, someone from Walter's side of extended family curious about the estate for reasons that had nothing to do with her at all. She told herself this even as some quieter, more honest part of her had already started narrowing the possibilities down to the two people who actually knew enough fragments of her mother's history to think to ask in the first place. She didn't want to believe it. Wanting not to believe something and actually not believing it turned out to be two very different experiences, and Simone spent that entire drive home learning the difference between them in real time. Simone didn't confront anyone immediately. There's a version of this story where she storms home that same afternoon and demands answers, and that simply isn't what happened. She drove home in something closer to numb calculation than anger, running through everyone in her life who might have had reason or opportunity to make an inquiry like that, and landing, uncomfortably, on the two people she trusted most completely. She didn't say anything to Marcus that night. She didn't say anything to Renee either. She told herself she needed more information before she let herself believe something that ugly about either of them, and in hindsight, some part of her was simply not ready yet to lose two relationships in the same week she had just gained an entire family history she never knew existed. Over the following weeks, Simone became someone the people around her didn't seem to fully recognize. Quiet, in a deliberate way, rather than an oblivious one, watching instead of reacting. She started paying closer attention to small inconsistencies she had never bothered to notice before, the way Marcus's phone stayed face down more often than it used to, the way certain evenings he described as work dinners didn't quite match the details he offered when she asked casual follow-up questions. She noticed, too, a shift in how Renee talked about her own life whenever Simone brought up anything related to her grandfather, a carefulness that hadn't been there before, questions that circled the subject without quite landing on it directly. None of it was proof yet. All of it was enough to keep Simone watching. During those weeks of quiet observation, Simone found herself replaying years of memories through an entirely different lens, searching for moments she might have previously dismissed too easily. She thought about a work trip Marcus had taken 8 months earlier, one where Renee had, coincidentally, been visiting the same city for what she described at the time as a friend's bridal shower. She thought about how often, over the previous year, Renee had found small reasons to be at their house on evenings when she knew Marcus would be home from work, but Simone would still be finishing up grading papers in another room. None of these details had seemed significant while they were happening. Assembled together, in the specific light of what Foster Lange had told her, they formed a pattern Simone found difficult to unsee once she finally allowed herself to look at it directly. The confirmation, when it finally came, arrived through Foster Lange rather than through anything Simone uncovered herself. Foster called to inform her that estate records showed the earlier inquiry had come through a specific email address, one the outside counsel had kept on file as standard practice, and asked whether the name attached to it meant anything to Simone. It was Renee's email address, the same one she had used for over a decade, the same one attached to birthday invitations and vacation photos and every small, ordinary exchange of a 20-year friendship. Simone sat with that information for a long time before she did anything with it. She thought about that lunch a year earlier, the offhand comment about her mother's family having more money than anyone let on, and understood, finally, that it hadn't been offhand at all. What Simone pieced together over the following days, through careful conversations with Foster Lange and through her own quiet observation, was a timeline that reframed almost everything she thought she knew about the last year of her marriage. Renee had made that inquiry roughly a year earlier. Around the same time, it turned out, that her relationship with Marcus had shifted from friendship into something else entirely. There's no evidence that Renee orchestrated the affair purely as some calculated scheme from the very beginning. What the evidence does suggest is that once Renee suspected there might be real money attached to Simone's family, she mentioned it to Marcus in confidence, and Marcus, rather than telling Simone any of this himself, quietly filed the information away and began positioning himself, both emotionally and eventually physically, toward whichever version of his future looked most secure. Simone chose a Saturday afternoon for the confrontation, deliberately, because she wanted daylight and clear heads rather than the kind of late-night emotional confrontation people expect from moments like this. She invited Marcus and Renee to the house separately, under the pretense of discussing logistics around the estate, and let them discover each other sitting in the same living room only once they had both already arrived, watching the brief, unguarded look that passed between them before either one had time to compose an explanation. That look alone told Simone most of what she needed to know before she had even opened the folder in front of her. She sat down across from both of them, set the folder on the coffee table between them, and simply began speaking, calmly, methodically, the way Foster Lange had taught her to present information that needed no embellishment to land with its full weight. Simone didn't raise her voice. She didn't raise it once throughout the entire conversation, which surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise them. She walked through the timeline exactly as she and Foster had reconstructed it: the lunch conversation, the email inquiry, the casual question Marcus had asked about her grandfather's line of work months before anyone died, the pattern of coincidental visits and convenient absences she had quietly assembled over the preceding weeks. Marcus's face shifted through several expressions before settling into something like resignation, the specific look of a man who understood, in real time, that the story he had prepared no longer matched the facts sitting in front of him on that coffee table. Renee said almost nothing throughout, which felt, in its own way, like the clearest confession either of them offered Simone that afternoon. Marcus called almost daily during that stretch, sending messages that grew increasingly elaborate in their attempts to reframe what had happened, describing his silence about the earlier inquiry as protective rather than calculated, insisting that whatever had developed with Renee had been a mistake born out of loneliness rather than opportunity. Simone read every message carefully, not because she believed any of it, but because she wanted to understand exactly how far he was willing to rewrite the story now that the version he had been quietly counting on no longer worked in his favor. There was one message in particular, sent late one night, where he wrote that he had always loved her regardless of any of this, a sentence that might have meant something to Simone a year earlier, and meant nothing at all to her now, arriving as it did only after the size of what he stood to lose had become undeniably real. What Simone did next, she did deliberately, without rage, even though many watching this might expect otherwise. She met with Foster Lange formally, not just as the estate attorney handling her grandfather's affairs, but as legal counsel guiding her through the divorce that followed. Because there had never been a prenuptial agreement between Simone and Marcus, drafted back when neither of them had anything worth protecting, Foster helped her build a case establishing the clear timeline of his knowledge and his subsequent conduct, evidence that mattered significantly once the inheritance became part of the marital conversation. Foster walked Simone through the process with a patience that Simone came to appreciate more with time, explaining that without a prenuptial agreement, Georgia law would typically consider marital assets acquired during the marriage subject to equitable division, but that Marcus's demonstrated prior knowledge of the inheritance, combined with the timeline of his relationship with Renee, gave Simone significant leverage in negotiating a settlement that protected the estate almost entirely. Simone and Foster spent several sessions compiling documentation, bank records showing small, unexplained withdrawals Marcus had made in the months before the will reading, text messages between him and Renee that predated any admission of a physical relationship, screenshots of the email inquiry Renee had sent to the estate's outside counsel. None of it was gathered out of spite. All of it was gathered because Foster understood, better than Simone did at the time, that clarity and documentation protect people in situations exactly like hers far more effectively than anger ever could. Simone made sure, through entirely legal and documented means, that Marcus walked away from the marriage with nothing beyond what he had brought into it himself. No claim whatsoever on a fortune he had spent the better part of a year quietly hoping to attach himself to. With Renee, the reckoning took a different shape entirely, because the damage she had caused wasn't primarily financial, it was personal, built on 2 decades of trust she had decided, at some point, was worth risking for a chance at proximity to money she assumed Simone would never notice her circling. Simone didn't need legal counsel to address what happened with Renee. She simply stopped answering her calls, removed her completely from every part of her life, and made sure, through the small, interconnected professional circles they had once shared, that people understood exactly why. Simone never fabricated anything or exaggerated what happened. She simply stopped protecting Renee's reputation the way a loyal friend instinctively does, and the truth, left to travel on its own, did the rest of the work without any additional effort from her. There was a specific moment, a few months after everything became public within their shared circle, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned, carefully, that Renee had lost a promotion she'd been pursuing at her firm after a client she'd been introduced to through Simone's own family connections quietly withdrew their business once the full story became known. Simone felt something complicated hearing that, not quite satisfaction, not quite guilt, something closer to a recognition that consequences, left alone to unfold naturally through networks she hadn't even realized she still had influence over, have a way of finding people without requiring active pursuit. Simone never once reached out to that client herself. She never needed to. The truth, once it was free to travel through the same circles Renee had always relied on for her own advancement, simply did what truth tends to do once nobody is left protecting the person it belongs to. Simone spent a significant part of that first year after the divorce simply relearning how to trust her own instincts again, since so much of what she thought she understood about the people closest to her had turned out to be built on assumptions rather than evidence. She started journaling most nights, not out of any particular discipline, but because writing things down helped her separate what she actually knew from what she had simply hoped was true for the sake of comfort. She remembers writing, maybe 4 months in, that the hardest part wasn't losing Marcus or losing Renee specifically, it was losing her own confidence in her ability to read people accurately, a confidence she had carried her entire adult life without ever once questioning it. Rebuilding that confidence took considerably longer than any legal proceeding did, and in some ways, it remains a project Simone is still quietly working on even now. Foster Lange became, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the steadiest presences in Simone's life throughout that entire year. Someone whose steadiness had nothing to do with personal affection and everything to do with a kind of professional integrity Simone had never had reason to rely on so heavily before. Foster never once pushed Simone toward anger or toward reconciliation, never offered opinions about what Marcus or Renee deserved beyond what the law and the documentation actually supported. Simone asked her once, during a particularly difficult meeting, how she managed to stay so measured while walking her through details that clearly infuriated Simone even as she explained them. Foster told her that measured was the only thing that actually protected people in situations like Simone's, that anger felt satisfying in the moment but rarely built anything that lasted, while clarity and patience tended to build outcomes that held up long after the initial satisfaction of anger would have faded. Simone made a decision, a few months into the process, about the house itself, the enormous property where she had first learned everything that eventually unraveled her marriage and her closest friendship. Rather than sell it immediately, which is what most people assumed she would do, Simone chose to keep it for a while, spending occasional weekends there alone, slowly learning the rooms her grandfather had lived in for decades without her. She found, in a box in the study, letters he had apparently written to her mother over the years and never sent, drafts full of apologies he clearly never found the courage to actually deliver. Reading those letters didn't erase the damage of the estrangement, but it did complicate the picture Simone had originally formed of him as simply a cold, demanding man who had let his daughter walk away without a fight. People, Simone has learned, are rarely as simple as the single story we first hear about them, whether that person is a grandfather she never met or a husband she thought she knew completely. Simone's mother and Simone grew closer during that same period, in ways neither of them expected. Her mother started coming over most Sundays, and they would sit together going through old photographs Foster had eventually sent over from the house, pictures of Simone's mother as a child that Walter had kept tucked away for decades without ever showing anyone. There was one photograph in particular, Simone's mother at maybe 7 years old, laughing at something just outside the frame, that her mother stared at for almost a full minute before finally saying, quietly, that she didn't remember being that happy as often as the photograph suggested she must have been. That photograph did something for both of them that no legal settlement or inheritance ever could. It gave Simone's mother permission to grieve a relationship she had spent decades convincing herself she didn't need to grieve at all. A colleague at Simone's school asked her once, not long after everyone in their small circle had learned pieces of the story, why she kept teaching at all given everything that had changed financially in her life. Simone told her honestly that the classroom was one of the only places left where she felt completely certain of her own footing, where nothing about her worth depended on what anyone else decided to do with the trust she gave them. 9-year-olds don't calculate what you're worth before deciding how much of themselves to give you. They simply show up, curious and unguarded, and Simone found, in the months after everything with Marcus and Renee fell apart, that being around that kind of uncomplicated honesty every single day did more to steady her than almost anything else in her life during that period. Simone also made a decision with a portion of the inheritance that surprised even Foster Lang, setting aside a fund specifically for scholarships at the same elementary school where she has taught for years, quietly, without attaching her name to any of it publicly. It felt important to her that something good come out of all of this that had nothing to do with settling scores or proving a point to anyone who had wronged her. She remembers signing the paperwork for that fund and feeling, for the first time since the entire ordeal began, something that resembled genuine peace rather than vindication. Money, Simone has come to understand, doesn't actually change who a person is underneath everything else. It simply reveals, with unusual clarity, who people already were the whole time, and gives you the chance, if you're paying attention, to decide what you want to do with that information once you finally have it. Word eventually reached Simone, months later, through people they had once shared in common, that Marcus's relationship with Renee hadn't survived the fallout either, unraveling within weeks of the divorce finalizing. Once whatever had drawn them together in secret no longer carried the charge of something forbidden, and instead had to stand on its own as an ordinary relationship built on nothing more than what remained after the scheme collapsed. Simone felt no particular satisfaction hearing that, though some watching this might expect her to. By that point, she had largely stopped measuring her own healing against what happened to either of them, understanding finally that their outcomes, whatever shape they eventually took, had very little bearing on the life she was quietly building for herself in the meantime. There's a particular kind of quiet Simone has grown to appreciate in the years since all of this settled. A quiet that has nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with finally living inside a life she trusts completely. She still has close friends, a smaller circle now, deliberately so, people she's watched carefully enough over time to trust the way she once trusted Renee without ever having to question it. She dates occasionally, cautiously, though she's in no particular hurry to rebuild the kind of certainty she once had about a person, only to discover, years later, that certainty and truth were never actually the same thing. What she has instead, most days, is something steadier than either of those relationships ever gave her, a kind of self-trust she had to lose almost everything else in order to finally build. There are still moments, usually late in the evening, when Simone remembers the version of Marcus who sat on the floor of their first apartment, joking about couches they couldn't afford, and the version of Renee who drove 3 hours without hesitation the night Simone's car broke down, years before any of this began. Those versions of them were real. Simone didn't imagine either one. What she's had to accept is that people are capable of being genuinely present in your life for years, and still, eventually, choosing to weigh your worth against an opportunity they think you'll never notice them considering. Holding both of those truths at once, the real affection and the eventual calculation, has been harder for Simone than choosing to believe only one or the other ever could have been. Simone's grandfather, a man she never once met, left her considerably more than money. He left her the opportunity to finally see clearly who had been standing beside her the whole time, and who had simply been waiting to see what standing beside her might eventually be worth. If there's one thing to take away from Simone's story, let it be this: trust, given freely for years without question, is exactly the kind of thing certain people learn to quietly build their own plans around, waiting patiently for the moment it might finally pay off for them rather than for you. Simone gave 20 years of loyalty to a friendship and a decade of faith to a marriage, and both turned out to be watching, quietly, for an opportunity neither of them ever expected to actually arrive. It arrived anyway. And when it did, Simone learned exactly who they really were underneath everything she had always assumed about them. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the people closest to you had a price they were quietly waiting to discover, would you ever really know it until something finally tested it? If this story affected you the way it affected us telling it, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that someone close to you had been quietly waiting to see what you were worth the whole time?